Hello, my name is Karolina Watroba, and this is a short session on perspective, a part of the German Literature Masterclass this year. So, why is narrative perspective important to look at when we study literary texts? Well, it can help us understand them much better and on a much deeper level. And here are some questions that you can ask yourselves to help you get started. First of all, how is the story told? Who tells the story? So this second question makes it more explicit, more specific. Who is the narrator? What do we know about them? Is it a first-person narrator, a third-person narrator? Do we get to know more about this person? Or is it a sort of impersonal voice? And what are the consequences of all this for our understanding of the story? And here, zooming in even more closely on one specific aspect of this, how much does the narrator know about the story they're telling? Is the suggestion that they know everything, even more than what they share with us? Or do we think that the narrator tells us everything they know, so we follow the story from their point of view, learning everything that they are learning about the story? There are different possibilities that authors can play with here. Or perhaps, another interesting possibility, perhaps it feels like we actually know more than the narrator themselves. Perhaps the narrator is a child and doesn't really understand the implication of everything that is happening, but we, readers, have a better grasp of this based on what we're reading about. So this shows you the spectrum of possibility here. Now, is the narrator emotionally involved in the story? Another very specific question you can ask. Is the narrator somehow benefiting from the events they're describing or being harmed by them? Do they show sympathy, compassion for the characters they're describing? Or are they completely distanced? Does it feel like they're actually observing the events from the outside, or maybe from above? By figuring out how the narrator relates to the story, we can better analyze our own involvement or what the text is trying to get us to do. How does the text want us to respond to the story? Another interesting question. Is the narrator reliable? Do we trust them? Do we think he or she is telling us the truth? There are some narrators in literary texts who actually lie to the readers. There are some narrators who just don't have a good grasp on the event, so even though they don't mean to be unreliable, they actually end up being unreliable, such as child narrators. I have already mentioned this is a possibility. So these are some questions to bear in mind about the narrators. The last question I put on the slide is this: from whose point of view is the story told? You might be tempted to say, well, obviously from the narrator's point of view. But as you will see in some examples I will show you in a minute, the narrator can sometimes side with one specific character. They might stick to this one character for the entirety of the text, or they might shift from one character to another as the text progresses. But the point is that they might choose to actually filter the event, as it were, through the point of view of this one specific person. And this really changes how we receive the text, which is why this question is also important to consider as you read. All right, well, let's look at a couple of examples, shall we? So this example up here is the first sentence of one of the most famous short stories in the German language by Franz Kafka from 1915, so over 100 years ago. And I'll read it out to you, and I'll give you the English translation in a moment. Als Gregor Samsa eines Morgens aus unruhigen Träumen erwachte, fand er sich in seinem Bett zu einem ungeheuren Ungeziefer verwandelt. Okay, so some of these words I suspect you won't know, but some of them I think you might have encountered. Morgen, eines Morgens, morning, one morning, Träume, dreams, bed. You can see how all these words are actually quite similar to the German words. Fand er sich, he found himself in seinem Bett, in his bed. Unruhig, you might know Ruhe, which is sort of quiet. So unruhig is the negative form of the adjective, so we could say uneasy maybe, or disturbed, something like that. And then Gregor Samsa is the name of the character. Als, when, referring to an event in the past. Erwachen means to wake up. So I think you can start putting all this together. Verwandelt, the last word here, the verb, quite a crucial word, because the title of the story is Die Verwandlung, so the noun that comes from this verb, and it means a transformation or a metamorphosis. And this metamorphosis that we see in this very first sentence, and you'll notice that I left out these two long words in the last line, ungeheuer and Ungeziefer. These are quite uncommon words, and let's look at how one of the many English translators of this story rendered those in English. So this is the first English translation that ever was published. As Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a gigantic insect. Well, what can we figure out about the narrative perspective from this first sentence? It's just one sentence, but I think we actually learn an awful lot. So first of all, we know that we don't have a first-person narrator here. There's a main character, Gregor Samsa, but he's not the narrator. But I think the narrator is actually stays quite close to the perspective of this protagonist of Gregor Samsa. How do we know? Well, the narrative starts as Gregor Samsa is waking up, right? So it seems to be tied to Gregor's consciousness, awareness. And the very first thing that we're told is the kind of dreams that Gregor had. So again, staying close to what is happening inside Gregor's head. And the impression upon waking up, this big shock that he experiences. He found himself transformed in his bed into a gigantic insect. We don't just yet find out anything more about his surroundings. We're sort of almost tied to the very bed in which Gregor Samsa is waking up. Now, what else do we find out about the narrative voice? Are they emotionally involved with the story they're telling? I don't think so. It's quite an extraordinary event, but the narrator isn't expressing any sort of shock or even just surprise. He's just stating it in quite a matter-of-fact way. And if you read the whole story, you'll see that this becomes quite an important characteristic of how this narrator is telling this extraordinary story. He's treating it as just a set of events that we just have to accept. They happened. We have to follow along. What else can we say about the narrator here? We've already said that they are a third-person narrator. As we find out later in the story, they have quite a lot of knowledge about the world in which this is happening, but they choose to stay quite closely to Gregor Samsa's, to the protagonist's own impressions and perceptions. They don't seem to be very involved emotionally with the story. They relate it to us in quite a matter-of-fact way, which seems quite jarring given the shocking content of the story they're telling. So this sets us up for quite an engaging and unsettling narrative, and I would encourage you to read it if you're interested. It's a really good text, one of my favorites. Okay, so let's now have a look at a very different narrator. In this passage, it's towards the beginning of a novel from 1932 by Irmgard Keun, who was a very popular novelist in the Weimar Republic, so in Germany between the two world wars. She was very widely read, sold lots of copies of her books, and all of her books, including this one from which I took this quotation, are about sort of city life, big city, modern, busy streets. She always has protagonists who are young women. Often they come to those big cities from the countryside, they discover it for the first time, they're growing up and they're meeting all those new people and they find themselves in those new surroundings and they have all these ideas for who they want to become. And you'll see how this translates into this passage that we have here. And again, I'll read it out in German and then I'll show you the English translation. Und ich denke, dass es gut ist, wenn ich alles beschreibe, weil ich ein ungewöhnlicher Mensch bin. Ich denke nicht an Tagebuch, das ist lächerlich für ein Mädchen von 18 und auch sonst auf der Höhe. Aber ich will schreiben wie Film, denn so ist mein Leben und wird noch mehr so sein. Again, I think there are quite a lot of words here and grammatical structures that you are familiar with. Und ich denke, dass es gut ist, wenn ich alles beschreibe. And I think it's good if I beschreiben. It's a bit like schreiben, but beschreiben. It's to describe. Not just to write, but to write about something, so to describe something. Because I am a what person? Ein ungewöhnlicher Mensch. Gewöhnlich means sort of usual, customary, nothing special. Ungewöhnlich is the opposite of this, extraordinary, special. Ich denke nicht an Tagebuch. I'm not thinking of a Tagebuch, a day book, a book in which you write every day, a diary. That's how German compounds work. You can sometimes work out the meaning from its component parts. And moving on, das ist lächerlich für ein Mädchen von 18 und auch sonst auf der Höhe. Mädchen, girl, Mädchen von 18, girl of 18, i.e. a girl who is 18-year-old, an 18-year-old girl. Lächerlich, you probably know lachen, to laugh. Lächerlich is an adjective that comes from lachen and it means laughable. That's laughable for a girl who is 18 years old. Und auch sonst auf der Höhe. This is a bit of like a set expression. Höhe, height. So literally this is on the height, high up. And here it's meant metaphorically, sort of in her prime. The height of her life, the high point of her life. But, ich will schreiben wie Film. I want to write like film. Because so ist mein Leben. That's how my life is. Und wird noch mehr so sein. And it will become even more so. It will only get more like this. Okay, let's look at the published English translation. Slightly adapted. And I think it'll be a good thing if I write everything down, because I'm an extraordinary person. I don't mean a diary. That's ridiculous for an 18-year-old girl in her prime, but I want to write like a film, because my life is like that, and it's going to become even more so. Okay, so what do we find about the narrative perspective here? First big difference to the previous passage we looked at, we have a first-person narrator. They are much more involved in this story, clearly very emotionally invested. we can also, we find out here exactly who they are, right? An 18-year-old girl. And this narrator gives us actually quite a lot of information about what kind of narrator they want to be. I had some trouble with my tech, but let's just finish talking about this passage by Irmgard Coin. What do we find out about this narrator? It's a first-person narrator, an 18-year-old girl, quite excited about her life, right? Maybe quite conceited, or at least very confident. Or maybe this is sort of a show that she puts on a little bit to make herself feel more confident. Ich bin ein ungewöhnlicher Mensch and all that. She's telling us about her hopes and her aspirations for her writing. She doesn't want it to be like a Tagebuch, like a diary. She thinks that's laughable, lächerlich, ridiculous. But she tells us that she wants to write like film, schreiben wie Film. Film is still a relatively new medium in the 1930s. It's been around for a couple of decades, but it's still very much associated with technological development, modernity, city life, fancy cinemas, entertainment, this mass entertainment which is really conquering these European cities for the first time in history. So this is modern, this is something new. Telling stories through film feels more fresh to this narrator than telling them through literature, but she's saying she will actually be trying to write like a film. So she is trying to occupy both these ways of telling a story at the same time. And she thinks that this is appropriate to her life and how her life is going right now. So we can tell an awful lot about her and how she sees her own writing in this very short passage. We can tell that she's hugely emotionally involved. Perhaps this will mean that she won't be entirely reliable. There's this tension between her wanting to write everything down, which would suggest that she will be incredibly reliable because she will just be noting down everything as it happens, but because we can tell that she is so invested in her own story that we might anticipate, her attempts to maybe color things a certain way to make herself look good. All of these possibilities open up for us just from reading this short passage, these 3 sentences. All right. One last thing I wanted to address at the end of this short talk is perspective in plays. When we talk about narrative perspective, we usually have in mind narrative texts, right? So books, as in novels, short stories, and so on. But I think even if you read a play or watch a play in the theatre, you can also think about how events are presented to us. So this question of perspective can be really very useful here as well. So let's look at some questions that we can ask about perspective in plays rather than prose texts. How is the story presented to us? And here are some more specific things we can look at. Is the audience ever directly addressed by one of the actors on stage? Is the play easy or hard to follow? Does the play make it easy for us or hard for us to follow? This will really impact our perspective on the events wanted. Do we get emotionally involved in the story? Does the play invite us to get emotionally involved in the story? How does the play engage us, the audience, in the events it shows us? To what extent does the play resemble real life? Are we invited to sort of suspend our disbelief and assume that we're just witnessing a real life event? Or is the play really messing with our ideas about how events happen in real life and offering us some maybe comic or maybe just exaggerated or a completely mad, crazy perspective on events? Do we adopt the point of view of one character? Another good question. Does the play really want us to side with one of the characters? Does somebody get much more stage time than other characters? Is there maybe one character who often addresses us directly, to look back to the second question on the list? These are all interesting questions to ask, which can direct our attention to interesting techniques that playwrights use to tell their stories through drama. Thank you.